for the opportunity to come and talk to you today. And I should say that we focus on the first 2,000 days of life, and actually we're really at the first 1 or 2 days of our own life as an institute. In fact, in September, we had a launch of the institute, and we're actually now named not just the Institute for Human Development, but the Fraser Mustard Institute for Human Development, in recognition of the tremendous work that Fraser Mustard did during the latter part of his life to focus on the importance of the early years to future learning and well-being of children as they grow up. And essentially what I want to talk to you today about is some of the work of the Institute, but primarily trying perhaps to convince you that the early years are actually very important for the health, for the learning and the social functioning of that child throughout its life course. And so, and I'd be happy as we go through this to keep it very informal, and if you have questions, just shout them out and we can try and address them. So, if we think of disease burden in global terms in the 21st century, the United Nations now believes that the efforts that it has placed into infectious disease, which were its focus for the last 10 or 20 years, are bearing fruit. Efforts around HIV/AIDS, efforts around malaria are starting to make improvements in the health of populations, particularly in developing countries. And it feels that the new emerging areas which it needs to put additional focus are in the areas of non-communicable disease. Diseases such as metabolic disorders, around obesity and diabetes, around mental health disorders of anxiety and depression, such like. And so it's felt by the United Nations that this will be where it puts a lot of its focus in the coming years. And the World Economic Forum have suggested that by 2030, these diseases, which are largely diseases of adulthood, or have been largely diseases of adulthood, will cost society around $47 trillion per year. And there are questions, not only in the developing world, but in the developed world, as whether our healthcare systems and our social services systems are actually sustainable with the onslaught that's likely to come. So if one takes mental health as perhaps just one of these non-communicable chronic diseases, we know that 1 in 5 Canadians will experience a mental illness in their lifetime. Interestingly, 70% of mental health problems, even though they're primarily adult diseases, actually start in childhood and adolescence. They can track these disorders back to behavioral disorders and other things in childhood. And young people 15 to 24 are more likely to report mental illness and substance use disorders than any other age groups. So in Canada, mental illness is the second leading cause of human disability and premature death, and again, it's a huge cost to society, not only in treatment, but in the economic fallout from these disorders. So I think the issue here is this disease of adulthood primarily, and older age, is actually, we're recognizing, has earlier onsets.
Can I just ask how you know that? You said that 70% of mental illness happens in childhood and adolescence.
So I think these are incidences that are now being gathered around the country. Childhood mental illness has been an area that's really been largely neglected. And there was a summit meeting last year in Winnipeg by the Council of the Confederation, so all the governments come together, and they've had a number of reports now that have gone out and tried to assess this across all the healthcare systems and the education system. So that's where those sorts of data have come from. But I must admit that the true extent really hasn't been identified because it's been a neglected area.
Could you tell me how you define mental illness?
So I'm not exactly sure what definitions they used for that. I think they include behavioral disorders as well, rather than just the ones in the DSM.
Because that's a very high statistic on the
Yeah,
slide.
yeah.
I'd like to know how you define that.
Yeah.
Where would you get that information?
I could try and find it. I think there are some reports now coming out of that summit, the Council of the Federation. If you go on, there's a website, and they were trying to gather all that data around early origins of mental disorders. So if one looks at another disorder of adulthood, the metabolic disease, and these would include things like obesity, diabetes, cardiovascular disease, then this worldwide is an epidemic. We know that worldwide 366 million people suffer with diabetes, and the current cost is, again, around about $500 million. Generally, it used to be thought of that these were diseases of Western world lifestyle. But actually, the fastest rates of increase in diabetes and obesity are occurring in the developing countries, such as India and China. There are massive amounts of obesity, and it's generally not recognized because, at least in India, the phenotype of the disease is different. It's not external obesity, it's actually obesity that occurs around internal organs, which is actually more serious in terms of links to diabetes. And critically, obesity and diabetes are hugely important here in Canada in terms of the First Nations people. They have rates of obesity and diabetes that are much greater than the non-native population. And the groups, or the demographics within that population that are being affected are younger people and women. And it's women of reproductive age that are actually showing the greatest levels of obesity and diabetes. And this is particularly troubling because there are very good data now showing that a woman that is obese and has diabetes during pregnancy will program her fetus for diabetes and obesity as it grows up through an impact on insulin exposure of the developing fetus. Now, I've tried to make the case that these chronic diseases are important to society, but the main point I'm going to try and make today is that the environment during the first 2,000 days of life, so we've sort of defined that from conception to school, that period actually establishes that child on trajectories that will impact that child's health, their learning ability, and their ability to form optimal social relationships. And I hope to show some of that data to you today. So the bottom message is that these chronic diseases of adult have their origins in early life. And these are some data from Clyde Hertzman, the University of British Columbia. And he's looked at this in general, and this is a sort of a summary slide to show how different disorders and diseases throughout the life course are impacted by this period of early life. So his data would suggest, and the data that he's gathered from other sources, that in the second decade of life, early life influences issues around school failure, around teen pregnancy and criminality. In the third and fourth decades, around obesity, elevated blood pressure, depression. In the fifth and sixth decades, around coronary artery disease and diabetes. and then in older age, premature aging, memory loss. So these are mostly association studies, epidemiologic studies, and in terms of some harder data from animal studies where obviously the animals don't go into the 5th and 6th decade, but we can show effects on their health across the life course. So one would say, well, why is it that this period of early life can have impacts on the individual throughout its life? And I think from a biological point of view, we would suggest that this period of time is a period of the most massive, dramatic development that we're going to have during our lives. So if one thinks over a period of 40 weeks in utero, we go from a single cell, the fertilized egg, to a fully functioning human baby capable of emotions, capable of having all of its organ systems functioning, capable of its brain controlling all its body, capable over the next few years of being able to think independently, of express and develop language, of all the things that we think of as being human. And to be quite honest, the biology that needs to occur during this period of time is nothing short of miraculous. So this is during pregnancy, obviously, but then if we look during post-pregnancy years, we know that there are sensitive periods during which hard systems such as vision and hearing are being developed, when emotional control comes in, and then later periods when perhaps the higher order systems around language, social skills, number skills start to come in. So the idea is that this period, this 2,000 days, is a time of dramatic remodeling and development within the individual. And I think what we're starting to understand is that the environment in the global context in which that individual develops will have an influence on these systems that stay with it for the rest of its life. That isn't to mean that it's not changeable later. All it says is that there are large influences on these trajectories that take place early. And the person that sort of started to put some of these linkages together was an epidemiologist from the UK. He was actually a cardiologist, but he spent most of his time in epidemiology, and it was Professor David Barker. And David has put forward this concept primarily from the health side of things, how early life affects your health. And in many ways, he and Fraser were complementary, because Fraser Mustard focused more on how early life affect the individual's behavior and learning potential. So the first associations that David found were some studies where he was looking at deaths due to stroke and coronary artery disease in men aged 60 and over. And he noticed on a geographic basis across the United Kingdom that where men were dying of coronary artery disease and stroke were regions where 60 years before there had been very high rates of infant mortality. And interestingly, the association with death due to cardiovascular disease was where you were born and not where you lived your life. So if you were born in an area that had high infant mortality, but then you moved to an area where there was low infant mortality, you kept your risk largely from when you were born. And vice versa, if you were born in an area of low infant mortality but moved to one with high infant mortality, in general, you kept your risk from the low area. And so he felt that possibly this said something about how you developed before you were born or around the time you were born may play a role in linked up to these adult diseases, cardiovascular diseases. And he was fortunate that in Hertfordshire, they had kept remarkable records of the newborn period. In England at that time, there were health nurses, such as this nurse here, Nurse Ethel Burnside, who would go out around and make home visits to newborn, or to mothers that had had newborns, and then follow those children through the first years of life and make remarkably detailed records. And so David was able to go back and look at those records and then link them to mortality statistics 60 years later within Hertfordshire. And when he did that, and this is sort of an example of some of the records, so they were quite detailed. They got the weight of birth, the weight at first year, whether the baby was breastfed or bottle fed, the number of visits the nurse would make over that period, and details about the condition of the child on those visits. And so when he linked those to mortality statistics, he was able to show remarkably that the birth weight of individuals, both men and women, was related to their standardized mortality indexes from mortality due to coronary artery disease. So the bigger you were at birth, in general, the lower rate of death due to coronary artery disease you had than if you were born small. And that was the same for men and women. So later on, they were able to look at other disorders, and this is the risk of depression. And again, they found a similar association. The larger you were born, the lower the risk. The smaller you were born, the higher the risk. Now I want to, and then this has sort of gone on to be known as the developmental origins of health and disease. And what that sort of hypothesis said was low birth weight is associated with increased rates of the metabolic syndrome and chronic disorders such as diabetes, cardiovascular disease, anxiety, and depression. Now, I want to get totally clear right up front that this isn't something specific about birth weight. Birth weight is actually just a proxy. It was easy to measure. It was the only thing they measured at that time. And really, birth weight is a proxy for optimal or suboptimal development during that period. But it's just something that was relatively easy to measure. So the concept then is that early adversity during this first 2,000 days of life sets developmental trajectories for disease, learning, and social functioning across the life course. So what sort of diseases has been linked to early events, and what sort of adversities? And I've sort of told you a little bit about those diseases. They're mainly around metabolic disorders, cardiovascular disorders, and behavioral social function disorders. But more recently, there's starting to be some data linking to certain cancers. There's data now that link to breast cancer, and there's data now linking to premature aging disorders. So there's a study just come out of the Finnish Northern Birth Cohort, which linked early life adversity to longevity in their population. And what sort of adversities? Well, these, again, it's the environment, the world around that developing child. So there have been studies that have linked maternal stress to this programming, the effect of hormones in drugs, the effect of nutrition, both undernutrition and overnutrition or poor diet. It doesn't necessarily have to be the external environment to that baby. It could be how the placenta functions. The placenta is the lifeline to the exterior world for that baby, and if the placenta is not functioning, the baby won't get sufficient nutrients, won't get sufficient oxygen, may have differences in environmental toxins passed over to it. And then the other, we have to remember that there are genetic predispositions to these diseases as well. So it isn't just the environment, it's the environment layered on top of the already existing genetic predisposition that that individual is comes into at the time of fertilization. So those are fetal adversities. In childhood, there's very good data now linking low socioeconomic status to adversity in the child, linking unstable maternal-infant relationships, and essentially the richness of experience that children get within their first years of life. You all know that children are born with more synapses than they're ever going to have for the rest of their life, and a lot of the functioning of the brain and optimization of brain function is a loss of unneeded synapses and a strengthening of those that are induced by richness of experience. So I want to just move now to look at some experimental data that support some of the things I've talked about. And we have been fortunate enough to collaborate with a group at the University of Western Australia in Perth who in 1989 formed this RAIN study, or called the Western Australia Pregnancy Cohort. And essentially what they did is they recruited 2,900 pregnant women at 18 weeks of gestation. They got detailed obstetrical information on the mother and their babies. There were 68 live births, and then they've essentially followed the children for the last 21 years. And they have a remarkable data set on these children. They have information about their intrauterine growth, postnatal growth, physical activity, nutrition, drug use, psychosocial factors, familial factors, environmental factors. Basically, almost anything you can think of, they have evidence to support. And so we've been able to, and they've published a lot on how early life influences these children as they grow up. Now, I should say these children, or young adults, are now 21, and 21-year-old Australian children are remarkably healthy. I mean, it's a very affluent society, Perth, so there is, they don't have large amounts of diabetes or cardiovascular disease. But what we do see within the cohort is some of the origins, which we think may later lead to those, and we'll talk a little bit about some of those here. So the first study I wanted to talk about was by Monique Robinson, who's a clinical psychologist in Perth, and she was interested in early stressful events on the mother during pregnancy and how those might relate to behavioral and mental health disorders in the children up until age 14 when this study was done. And her definition of stressful life events were things like the death of a friend or relative, separation, divorce of the parents, relationship problems, money problems, moving house, job loss, those sorts of things. And essentially what Monique did was to come up with a score the number of these that occurred during the pregnancy, and then looked at behavioral and mental health disorders in the children. And essentially what she found was that you could have none or one or two of these, and it didn't make any influence on the incidence of mental health disorders or behavioral disorders. But once you got up above 3 or 4, then there was a significant increase in these behavioral disorders, suggesting that, first of all, that there's a degree of resilience in that developing child, and I think that's good. I mean, we don't want, biologically, we don't want a system where your life is sort of ended before you've been born. So there's lots of resilience in the system. But if there's a dramatic amount of stressful events, and what I don't have from the data that I've asked Monique if she could get, is to the extent to which those families which had adversity during pregnancy also had adversity during the early years as well. So there is sort of these data, but are there any other data out there, sort of experimental data, to suggest this link? And what are the mechanisms by which adversity could lead to disease in later years? So obviously you can't go around creating adversity in early development, at least in human populations, but there are some experiments of nature, if you will, that people have actually looked at. And one of these relates to the Dutch winter famine. So the Dutch winter famine occurred between 1944 and 45 in the winter. And essentially what happened was that the Germans, as they were retreating back from Holland, banned transport to the Netherlands of food. And essentially rations for the population, Dutch population, went from around 2,000 calories a day down to 400 to 800 calories a day. And essentially women got pregnant during this time, or already were pregnant. And there were opportunities then to follow the children that were exposed to this dramatic deprivation of nutritional intake over the next years. And essentially what they found was that the effect of this undernutrition, depending on the time at which it occurred during the pregnancy, and the organ systems that were developing during that time. So if a woman was in the third trimester when she was exposed to this famine, different effects, different health effects occurred than if she was pregnant in the first trimester when this occurred. And so this period of famine, they weren't actually that much born at a reasonable weight, just a few hundred grams. Significant adverse effects on their later life health. So these individuals are now in their sort of 60s and 70s, and we know that there were effects on their risk of coronary artery disease, on hypercholesterolemia, on raised blood pressure, and reduced glucose tolerance in the women that were exposed to the famine in the late or mid-gestation. Those in early pregnancy didn't seem to have those effects if they were exposed to the famine during the first trimester. But those pregnancies had a higher rate of congenital abnormalities in the central nervous system and an increased rate of schizophrenia and related disorders. And the greatest risk occurred among males born in the famine cities that were conceived at the absolute peak of the famine. So there's a few things here. One is there are sensitive periods during development when adversity affects different systems. The other one is that there are sex differences in the responses here. Males are affected in different ways than females, and if you're going to look at these sorts of relationships, you have to separate males and females to look at the responses. So there are also some animal experimentation data that's used the same sort of paradigm. In this study by Mark Vickers in New Zealand, essentially what they did was sort of try to mimic that famine, and they essentially took rats and gave them a controlled diet during pregnancy, or they gave the mothers a reduced caloric intake diet. And then when the animals were born, they then either gave them a normal diet or a diet with high in calories and fat content. And essentially what they found was sort of the same data, that if they looked at blood pressure, then if the animals that had the low calorie or undernourished diet had higher systolic blood pressure than those that had a normal diet as fetuses. But if they were exposed to a high-fat diet after pregnancy, those effects were amplified. And that held true, basically the same for fasting plasma insulin, and it also held true for behavioral measures. So these undernourished rats ate more than other rats when they grew up, and they moved around less. So these effects have been shown to be due to programming of systems in the brain that control food intake and locomotion activity. Essentially, that led to this model here that I don't know if you can see it properly, the couch potato rat that was programmed by low nutrition in pregnancy and sort of a Western diet as they grew up. But they've looked at a remarkable number of systems in these animals, and they find systems that are going to likely impact metabolic health in later life. The animals have fatty liver, hypertension, endothelial dysfunction, insulin resistance, leptin resistance. And then they have a number of systems that affect behavioral aspects of nutrition. So they have impaired thermogenesis, increased anxiety, hyperphagia, which I talked about. They have been able to show that this programming affects preference for high caloric content foods such as high fat. And a lot of this they think is due to programming of the hypothalamic pituitary adrenal axis in the developing fetus. So if we look now at some of the mechanisms that I sort of alluded to, there's a lot of evidence now to suggest that this prenatal environment and the early postnatal environment resulting from maternal adversity, nutrition, poor placental development, or exposure to glucocorticoids, as may occur in the case of babies that are likely to be born premature, in which the health professionals will give glucocorticoids to the mother to try and promote lung maturation. Then all these things are now thought to influence the developing brain or organ systems. And one of the ones, as I said, is the hypothalamic pituitary adrenal axis, and program that to function differently in postnatal life, and that this can affect fetal growth and development, and then later behavior and learning and disease susceptibility. One area that is also just starting to emerge here is the microbiome. So you probably know that actually we're more bacteria than we are human. We have more bacterial cells in our body than human, and actually, for that matter, we're more viral than human, because most of our DNA actually comes from retroviruses that have been inserted into our DNA during our evolution. But the bacteria, particularly those in our gut, play an incredibly important part in our physical functioning. Those bacteria obviously provide essential nutrients that we can't get from our nutrition, but they also produce metabolites that influence our brain function, that influence our immune system. And there's increasing evidence that this can be programmed during fetal life, and particularly during the first few years of life. So the baby gets its initial microbiome at the time of delivery, as it comes through the birth canal. And it takes a lot of the bacteria from the mother in at that time. Babies born by cesarean section have a totally different microbiome in their gut than those born by vaginal delivery. And over the course of the first 9 months of life, largely through milk that it gets through lactation. The baby solidifies that microbiome, and that largely stays with that baby for the rest of its life. So one can imagine how influences on the formation of that microbiome can affect the baby's ability to gain optimal nutrition during its life, and as I've said, influence on its immune function and behavior. I've suggested that glucocorticoids are an important contributor to this programming. If there is stress, there's increased levels of glucocorticoids in the mother, and we know that can affect the HPA axis in the fetus and affect the adrenal output of glucocorticoids in the newborn and in the child. And we know that glucocorticoids can impact elastin content of blood vessels, make them stiffer or more elastic, can affect nephron number, and both of these can influence hypertension. They can affect the adipoinsular axis and insulin leptin resistance. It can affect myocyte differentiation in the heart and synapse formation in the brain. So these steroids, which are part of the stress pathway, can have remarkable influences in our development. So I want to turn now to how the environment interacts with our genetic makeup to produce some of these effects. So we now know from GWAS studies that variations in genetic sequence can affect all sorts of adult diseases, and that's obviously been known and is increasing. But what's important to know is that the environment interacts with that. Even though you have a genetic predisposition to some of these diseases, the environment can either make that worse or actually mitigate the effects of that genetics. And I think that is very good news, because it means we can do something to reduce our genetic risk. But also, while this is actually variations in genetic sequence, so we can't change the sequence, but we can change the environment can actually not impact that genetic sequence, but it can actually modify how that genetic sequence is read through epigenetics. And I'll just talk a little bit about that as we go forward. So just a couple little bits of data to suggest how these interactions between the environment and genetics can work out. So these are some studies that some students in my laboratory, Brian Knight and Lauren Chen, did. And essentially what they did was, again, mimic some of those data from the New Zealand group, but in this case in mice. So what we did is we took two strains of mice, one called AJ and one called Black 6. Now, these are inbred strains, so essentially every mice in this group is a clone of itself. It's just like one, they have identical genetic makeup, unlike us, who all have slightly different genetic makeup. So if you think of these are two genetically dissimilar mice. And what we did is we reduced food intake to the mothers during pregnancy and then let the offspring grow up. And the Black 6 responded to this nutritional adversity to have altered growth trajectories. They had different body compositions, so they had increased fat mass, reduced lean mass, or reduced bone density compared to animals that had had normal nutrition during pregnancy. They had altered cardiovascular function, glucose intolerance, and insulin insensitivity. So they were essentially moving towards this metabolic syndrome. But this identical environmental challenge to the AJ mice basically didn't do anything. They had some changes. They were both sets of mice when they were born small. So the nutrition had impacted their growth during pregnancy. But for some reason, the genetic makeup of this mouse had made it resistant to the programming influences on its later life health, whereas this mouse was susceptible to that programming influences. And clearly, we'd like to know what is it about the genetic makeup of these two strains of mice that's different. But we would assume that in the human population, there would be almost infinite number of divisions between these mice in terms of our genetic makeup. So there would be a whole range of influences some of us will be less susceptible to early adversity, and some of us would be more susceptible. Let me use one other example here. So this is data looking at one particular genetic polymorphism in a gene called FTO, or the fat mass and obesity gene. And this gene was identified as a common variant in this gene, one single nucleotide difference, that was actually additionally looked for in a GWAS looking for diabetes, but it actually turned out to be linked not to diabetes but to adult obesity. If you have the adverse variant to this gene, so one single nucleotide difference, on average you have 3 kilos more fat mass as an adult than if you have the good genetic variant. And so essentially what we were able to do is go back to that RAIN study where we have data on the development of these children over the first 21 years of their life, and genotype them and compare the different genotypes as they grew up. So interestingly, so this is the adverse genotype here, and this is the good genotype. So if you look at this period of time, which is in utero, this gene that gives you increased BMI and fat mass as an adult actually produced lower growth as a fetus. And we don't know why that should be, although we've got some sort of speculation and guess. Over the first year of life, these babies, though, had dramatic catch-up growth. So in the first year of life, they caught up to where the other babies were. And then over the course of the 17 years in this study, because we only measured them up to 17, then these children did go on to have much higher BMIs than the children with the good variant of the gene. So this sort of follows the data that's been published in the literature. So essentially we've been able to show that there are influences during this life course on the growth of these children from this one genetic variant. But we're also able to go in and look at were there environmental factors that modified these parameters. And essentially what we were able to find was that nutrition in the first 3 to 6 months of life, in particular if the woman breastfed exclusively for 6 months, was able to take this adverse risk of higher BMI right back down to the normal. So, in other words, an environmental influence early in life was actually able to have a positive influence on these trajectories. On the other hand, nutrition in childhood and adolescence had a biphasic effect. The children that had what one might call Western McDonald's type diet actually accentuated this risk, whereas those that had a good diet, again, reduced their risk. So we're starting to learn that the environment interacts with one's genotype, but that environment can be both positive and negative. She says that. The other thing that we've just started to find out is another genetic linkage, and that's to do with telomeres. So telomeres are essentially the caps of your chromosomes. It's like the little plastic bits on our shoelaces. They protect the chromosomes during cell division. But generally, as cells divide, these telomeres start to shorten. The protective nature shortens. And if they get too short, essentially that cell then goes into senescence and dies, goes into apoptosis. So the length of telomeres has been used, or is being used now, as a measure of cellular aging. Elizabeth Blackburn got a Nobel Prize for this, and was also able to show that the rate at which that telomere shortening occurred was influenced by adverse environmental factors in adulthood, like stress and nutrition. So essentially we were able to go in, again, back into the range study and say, what are the influences on telomere length of the children? And so we took about 1,000 of the children during their 17-year follow-up, collected blood, and then measured the length of their telomeres, and then looked at associations with events during their life. And essentially what the data suggest are, again, good and bad influences of the environment. So if the mother experienced hypertension or preeclampsia during her pregnancy, and that's associated with poor placental development, so one might imagine nutrition and placental function would be suboptimal in those pregnancies, then that was associated with reduced telomere length and also increases in BMI in the children when they were 17. But again, if the mother breastfed for 3 to 6 months, that was associated at 17 years in the children with longer telomeres, better HDL, good HDL levels, and actually lower BMIs. Now these, the magnitude of these changes was not huge, but we're looking to follow these children and see, as they age, does that rate of loss of telomeres increase? There are some data just coming out of the Northern Finnish study again, suggesting that placental size and shape, which may be a proxy for placental function, actually influences longevity, such that if you have a, I think it was a thinner placenta, the influence on age of death was as much as 9 years. So I think we're just starting again to look at how early events may pan out later on. Just going to briefly say a little bit about epigenetics. So I said that epigenetics are a measure by which the environment can actually mark the genome. It doesn't change the sequence, but it marks the genome. And epigenetic variation has been shown to occur as a result of nutrition, smoking, environmental toxins, stress, and drug use. And essentially, it can influence the DNA in a number of ways, but essentially it puts chemical tags on the DNA that essentially affect whether the genes that are encoded by the DNA are turned on or off. So this is a way in which the environment doesn't change the sequence, but it affects whether those genes are expressed at a high level or a low level. And these effects are, again, sex-specific, age-dependent, time-sensitive, and can actually be transgenerational. So this epigenetic marking can actually go down through several generations. And that's been shown in some animal studies, but also in some studies in the some of these extended cohorts. Now, there are a couple of ways in which that occurs. It is possible that it may be a direct effect on the oocyte, because if you remember, oocytes are actually formed in the fetus. So a mother will actually have the oocytes that will form her grandchildren in her fetus. And it's possible that the environment could directly affect that, but much more likely we think it's through these sort of genetic mechanisms. And so I think what we're trying to put out here is that the environment during early life, and whatever that environment is, can influence your genetic susceptibility or your genetic makeup, and put you on different trajectories to, in this case, different disorders. But it's also known can influence your ability to learn and your ability to form social relationships. And essentially, that is what the Institute for Human Development is all about. We're trying to understand how this period of the first 2,000 days, and actually it's not really the first 2,000 days. There are data out there that the health of young women pre-pregnancy can impact their later life. And there's actually data now, it's been harder to get, but there's data coming out that the father's environment can impact it. So it's not just about mothers, it's just been that up to now it's been easier to gain data on the mothers than the fathers. But I suspect as we move forward, there'll be more and more showing that it's essentially the family that is responsible, not responsible, but is interacting. The other thing I should say, we don't know 100% whether all these programming influences in the environment are necessarily bad. It might be that programming anxious behavior is actually good if you're going to be born in an environment where being anxious and looking around and being a type A1 personality may actually get you further in life. So again, the focus has largely been around disease, but I think as we go on, we'll learn more about that it's really programming your brain and body in a way that's appropriate for your environment as you grow up. So it's a lot of the programming with the metabolic parameters where you want to eat more, your metabolism is at a lower rate, is fine if you're being born into a time of famine, because then you're going to be active, you're going to be going out there, you're going to be getting the right food, and those individuals that don't have those characteristics are going to die. So there's probably some evolutionary influences that have made these sorts of things happen. Where it becomes inappropriate is if you're programmed in utero and in life you aren't in that environment that supports that program. So I'll finish up there. I'll just say one thing is that the Institute is particularly interested in not just doing research, but seeing that research impact society. So we're very much interested in translation of research, knowledge mobilization, how that works into policies in all these domains, health, learning, and society. The Institute is a system-wide initiative within the university. It covers the faculties of health, of education, social work, arts and sciences, nursing, public health. We welcome anyone to get involved. We'd like to collaborate with your institute. And we're already starting to build connections beyond academia. So academia can do research, but if we want to actually make that research make a difference, we have to link up with the public sector and the private sector, particularly in our system with the public sector, because the government delivers health, delivers social services, and delivers education. And if we're to influence those, we need to link with government. And I think I'll stop there.
Can you put up your slide with your contact info?
Yes, let me, where was that actually? Well, actually, why don't I go down here? So the one thing I didn't have time to talk about actually is something called the Ontario Birth Study. And it may or may not be interest to you because it's going to take a long time before these people get to be elderly. But essentially, the Ontario Birth Study is, if you think of IHD as being the academic umbrella for this interest in early years on subsequent health, then the Ontario Birth Study will be our living laboratory. So essentially what we're planning to do, and it'll be piloted at Mount Sinai Hospital, which is starting, is to essentially offer all women coming in for antenatal care the opportunity to be part of this observation study. And it's in some ways like the RAIN study that was started 21 years ago. The differences are it will be bigger because we're offering all women. At Mount Sinai we have about 7,500 deliveries a year, and we're hoping that we can build up to about 5,000 of those. But it's not a closed cohort. So RAIN, they recruited 2,900 women and followed those through, which was incredibly valuable But the problem now is that we have information on the children during that development, but it's on what the environment was like 21 years ago, what the healthcare system was like 21 years ago, not what it is now. What we're planning to do is hopefully embed this into the healthcare system, so that eventually this is just data will be collected on the pregnancies. We'll get clinical information, we'll get questionnaire information about the socioeconomic circumstances, psychosocial health, nutrition, family circumstances, and also via specimens, whether they're blood, DNA, feces from microbiome, whatever. And then the plan is essentially to follow these children through pregnancy, childhood, adolescence, and their reproductive years by linking with pediatric and family practice health systems when they're born, and then also linking up with the education system. The government systems, whether it's health, social services, or education, actually capture remarkable amounts of information on children as they develop, but very little is actually made available to researchers, and none of it is actually linked. So there's no linkage between any of the hospitals and the pediatric practices, or the education, or the health service, or whatever. And if we can somehow link some of those data, I think it'll be a resource which the whole community can use, those interested in developmental health, child development, and maybe even aging. And the bottom line is the pre-pregnancy health of young women, and I would actually say the health and education of young women, their health during pregnancy, health of the child in infancy, is going to be very important on their health and well-being throughout the life course. And we're sort of suggesting that a focus here might be one way of promoting health and disease prevention for some of those diseases that I told you about in the first couple of slides that are threatening to overwhelm our public health systems. So you can, actually, I thought I had it there. So we have a website. It's www.humandevelopment, all one word, .utoronto.ca. And you are welcome to go in there and find out a little bit more about us. And as I say, we're in our infancy, but we're hardly born. We're still in the process of developing a strategic plan and how we're going to function. So we're open to suggestions from everybody. So thank you. And I'm happy to answer any questions.
Can I ask, with your study, will there be inclusion of the fathers of the babies?
Yes.
Because that's so important. I was sitting there thinking, I wrote down sperm.
Yeah.
I mean, honestly, because there has to be a connection somewhere with the baby. And if that study, if they're not included,
Yeah,
that's a huge component.
So the mechanics of how we do that are not easy. So firstly, we know that about 10% of the fathers are not the biologic fathers. People have done random sampling of DNA anonymously. So not in our study, but in other situations. So that's one thing we have to be aware of. Although, I think we'd say here that the DNA is one part, the environment that father and family creates, and the family is another aspect. But we do, the consent asks the mother whether we could approach the father. Sometimes the father comes in with the mother, and sometimes they don't. But our study is also linked to the Ontario Health Study. So when we recruit into the Ontario Birth Study, we'll offer the women the opportunity to enroll in the Ontario Health Study, which is an online health questionnaire that is also, they're trying to get at least a fraction of those people to get blood for DNA. And And we will ask the fathers to go and fill the questionnaires in as well, and we'll be able to link mother and father and child. I think you're right. I think it's going to be, it's just been easy up to now to focus on the mother.
I can imagine so many applications of what you do. Can you just mention some of the knowledge realization that you are planning on?
So I think we're already starting to talk to different ministries, for example. We've talked to the Ministry of Education, really about continuing some of the things that are ongoing from the Institute of Child Study or the Atkinson Centre, OISI, where they've been very active in this area of knowledge mobilization into education. The Ministry of Health is particularly interested at the moment in childhood obesity, and so we're trying to develop some linkages around there. I think the important difference about the Institute than what's gone before is we very much want to be transdisciplinary. So the child, as it develops, doesn't separate off and say, this is my health part, and this is my learning part, and then I've got a different part for how I interact socially. It's all the same. It's totally integrated. There's comorbidities. If you have mental health disorders that lead to obesity, that lead to learning, social functioning, everything's interwoven, right? It's the same brain. But academically, and in terms of governance, we've decided we're going to separate them out into different silos, right? So some people will focus not just on health, but they'll focus, I'm just going to do the obesity bit, or the diabetes, or the cardiovascular, or whatever, and then someone else does the education, someone else in social work does that. So what we're saying is, we need to model the child more than the academic structures. And so we're trying to bring people from everywhere, from all those different factors together. And then we're trying to go to government and saying, what are the issues in these domains that are a problem for you? Because we can do all the academic research we want, but if government isn't interested in, if they're not a problem for government, well, the chances are they're not going to get taken up. Now, it doesn't mean to say everything we're going to do is just because government wants to do it, but we're hoping that some of the things we want, some of the things the government want, will interact.
I'm just wondering about practical application. So if you want to reduce the incidence of mental health illness, anxiety, and depression, practically, how would you suggest doing that?
So there are a number of studies ongoing trying to look at some of that, and actually they're ongoing across the whole university. There are some studies looking at parenting and interaction. And the one thing about being in this position, I'm learning huge amounts. Right? My background is in sort of obstetrics and pregnancy health, but the institute is actually based at OISI, deliberately out of medicine. And so there are people in OISI in arts and science that are interested in parenting, and I'm learning that it's a two-way information exchange. So the parents obviously influence the baby, but how the baby responds actually can influence how the parents parent. And so there's stuff going on there. There's a lot of stuff going on around genetics and how behavioral influences of the developing brain can affect that. And I think to some extent we're at a still learning phase and looking at how those occur. At others we're saying, we don't have all the answers, but let's take a guess and say optimal parenting and bonding and a good support mechanisms in early life are unlikely to do any harm and could do well. So perhaps with this birth study, we might be able to introduce interventions. So the good thing, because it's ongoing, means that if we identify events, we can have interventions, and they might be focusing on target groups and bringing in intervention, but we'll have the whole backup of the Ontario birth study, all the other information that we're generating to actually go in and possibly test some of those events. There are other cohorts around. There's one called MAVEN. I think it's the maternal adversity and vulnerability in infants cohort. And essentially what they've done is taken high-risk families and following those families through and looking at some of these events as well. So, you know, our hope is that by learning how some of these trajectories are established, we can then possibly modify the environment to help mitigate some of these adverse effects. And there's a lot in childhood education in early years work going on in the Institute of the Child Study that's been doing it from an education point of view. It's just not been done from a whole child point of view.
Hi, Renee Lyons. I'm a research chair in chronic disease at Ridgepoint Health. And we've been trying to understand our population. These are people who are the highest cost to the system. Efforts, you know, they're circling around, trying to get better care for them. We did a study trying to look at 116 of our patients in depth to understand who are they, how did they get there, what do they present at this point, and in contrast a bit to the moving up, we've sort of been trying to look at how you can look at trajectories of complex patients and older patients, many of them are older, to looking back, and some of the work that we have on their experiences of just looking at their lives are amazingly interesting, even in terms of how they attribute some of their current health issues to, in a sense, a life where there is exposure to risk, unresolved conflicts in families, major social issues, and then going into a situation where they end up with fairly low resource when they have one health issue, which they need all these resources to cope and to prevent further health issues, but in fact do not have those resources. So things just, the trajectory just gets, you know, more and more complex going along. So the whole idea of trying to, I think, to get at some of these trajectories, when you look at the opportunities to prevent what we see, is huge. So, you know, I'm just really interested, I think, in how we begin to look at, from the early side, but the later side, how some of this knowledge can converge as to where we should actually invest in terms of prevention.
And I think it's important to know that, you know, it's quite likely that the things in early life, while might set up these trajectories, you know, there can be lots of events along the way that actually may be more predisposing. Right? So, you know, if you suddenly become a drug addict, then that, you know, clearly, you know, you might say there might be, put you at higher risk by some of these things early, but it's the actual process later on that induces it. So, you know, what we're talking here is much more around population influences rather than necessarily individual influences. Yeah, there are some data really sort of backing up yours. There's a data from Patrick McGowan at UT Scarborough in collaboration with some of his colleagues in Montreal, where they looked at the brains of, I think it was mostly men, but I'm not sure, who committed suicide. And they found that there were epigenetic changes in certain genes in the brain of those men who were abused as children. Now they didn't, and there weren't really good controls, because it was men that were abused and committed suicide against men that just died. And they didn't know whether the men that died of, say, like a cardiovascular accident, motor accident or something, they don't know whether they had child abuse. But there is certainly some evidence that, you know, early events can mark the brain of humans.
So, is there any evidence of that early sign can explain to the inflammatory biologic marker,
Yeah.
since this marker explain to the later disease in late life.
So there are, I don't know the specifics, but there are data out there that immune function is altered by early life experiences, by stressors, and by these same nutritional factors. We know that obesity is an inflammatory condition. And we know that the microbiome influences inflammation. So I know there are some data out there. I can't remember specifically what they are now.
There's a higher incidence of autism there.
Mhm.
And I was just curious what your thoughts were about.
Yeah, so at the moment I haven't seen any good data that links to autism. I know people are starting to look. There's obviously a lot in terms of genetics. Steve Scherer here at Sick Kids has been very interested in underlying genetics of autism. You know, it wouldn't surprise me if, again, it's going to be an interaction between genetics and something in the environment. That perhaps people who might have a genetic predisposition to autism will not express it if their environment is one type of environment, but will express that in a different type of environment. There are some studies just starting. So there are imaging capabilities that can capture sort of pictures of interacting insects and do like 1,000 frames per second or whatever, and pick up behavioral sort of modifications between interacting insects, and they're starting to see if they can apply that to children, to looking at interactions between mother and child in autistic children, and then see if they can apply that to as a screen in normal children, see if they can pick up the way in which the child engages with the mother is characteristic of autism, and whether you can pick up some minute signs of that in early life, and then if you can, maybe we can relate it to some of those issues. Anyway, thank you for your interest, and like I said, that we'd be very interested in collaborating with this institute and see if there's some way in which we can come together. We talked to the Ontario Brain Institute with Don Stuss, for example, and we've sort of said that he's been more interested in brain disease and brain damage. I think we're more in how the brain forms, but there must be some way in which we can link together. So thank you very much.